Good evening. It is wonderful to see everyone this evening. I'm thankful we can all be together to worship God and to continue our study from this morning. If you remember this morning, we looked at some aspects of managing media. And no, I'm not talking about being in charge of a news station. We're talking about all forms of media that we have access to, whether it be internet, whether it be phone, TV, radio, or whatever it might be. There is so much to consider when it comes to the influence, when it comes to the just all that encompasses the message that can come through any form of media. Especially for Christians, there is just a lot for us to unpack. So we talked this morning about the idea of managing our media, especially as it relates to how it influences us personally. Talking about things like how it influences us in terms of our worldview, in terms of learning, in terms of being fixated on it, things like that. Now we're going to shift slightly and talk about how media can influence not us as much, although it's included, but talk about how it can influence our relationships. So let's begin by looking at this idea here. Media can connect us to other people or isolate us from them. Media can connect us to other people or isolate us from them. I think most of y'all at this point know that without media, Liz and I probably would not be together. We met online. Online, the internet, that connected us to each other. And I will forever be grateful for that. Media can be a wonderful way of connecting with those who we can't be physically present with. I think about my parents and Liz's parents. We do drive to see them, several times a year, but it is several hours away, so we don't get to see them, every day, every other day. Think about friends like Connor, my best friend who was here last week, and I don't get to see him very often. But you know what? Because of technology, because of what we might call media, we get to stay in contact with our loved ones a lot more than we would otherwise be able to. And that is a wonderful blessing. But media can also do the opposite, can't it? It is designed in many ways to connect us, but in practice it often does quite the opposite. I remember when I was in college, I would have free time, of course, between classes and homework and whatnot, and there would be times where I would just, relax, watch a movie in the dorm room or play a game or something like that. But something that I always tried to hold on to anytime that I was in that situation was if I had an opportunity, if I had a choice to go and be with people or to be by myself doing something like a movie or a game or something like that, I always tried to make the decision to be with people. And it wasn't just because, I'm a people person. I've realized since then I'm kind of an introvert by nature. But it was because I always wanted to have a priority set in my mind before the choice actually came before me. I want to spend time developing relationships, and I want to prioritize that over other things. Far too often, because of the isolating nature of much of the technology that we have, technology can end up drawing us further away from one another rather than drawing us closer together. It's interesting, from the very beginning, we have a recognition by God that we are meant as human beings to be social creatures. We are meant to be in relationships, not just with God, although that's certainly the most important relationship, but we are meant to be in relationships with one another. God creates the first human being, but he doesn't leave him alone. In fact, he says, it is not good that he should be alone. He didn't just create Eve so that mankind could procreate and fill the earth with more humans. The initial point that God makes about why Eve needs to be created is because one person, one human being by themselves is not good. There needs to be companionship. There needs to be relationship. There needs to be friendship. And ultimately, just like any other tool, technology, media, it can be used either for good or for bad in this area of our lives. I can't help but think, as most of us have experienced this now in our lifetime, can't help but think about Hebrews 10 and verse 24. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. I think about just a couple of years ago now, although it seems like a lot longer, right? We weren't able to meet together for a time. There were obstacles in the way. We didn't want to get anyone sick. We wanted to take care of one another's health. But that hurt, didn't it? It hurt not to be together. I'm thankful that during that time, when by necessity we weren't able to be together, we were able to still have some kind of connection through technology. We were able to have things on Facebook and so forth that we were able to still, at least in some way, connect to one another. But it's nothing like being here together in person, is it? It's just not the same. And while this is true just of times that we gather together to worship as a church body, this is also true of our individual relationships with one another as Christians. Liz and I were just talking about before we walked out the door some of our friends that we were trying to be intentional about spending time with and keeping in touch with. And they live far away, and so it's kind of difficult, and we have to use that technology. But ultimately, even with the technology, it takes intentionality, doesn't it? It takes some intentionality. It's so easy just to let those relationships slip by the wayside. And we have a responsibility, both through technology that's available and, when possible, in person. We have a responsibility to stir one another up to love and to good works. And yet, it's far too easy to let that slide. I'm always, I wouldn't say amused maybe, but I'm always intrigued by John's words, and really in 2nd and 3rd John both, as he's signing off these letters. He's talking about some things, and of course very short letters, but they're short for a reason. Notice what he says in 2 John. Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. Now we understand John didn't have FaceTime available with him, right? In his day. He couldn't talk in video chat or something like that. He couldn't talk on the phone. So a letter is much less personal than some of what we have available today. But the point remains, even today, there's nothing like being face to face. There's nothing like time spent together in person. And I say all that to say, when it comes to our responsibility, and make no mistake, it is our responsibility to encourage, to strengthen one another as brothers and sisters in Christ, we have a responsibility both to use whatever tools we have at our disposal to that end, and as we talked about this morning, not to allow what we have at our fingertips to make us neglect such responsibilities. But secondly, kind of in connection with that, media can strengthen friendships, or it can damage them beyond repair. I think, for example, about, I guess it was yesterday, maybe? I can't remember, Alyssa, you might have to correct me, but I think it was yesterday, some of our friends from church camp, they just had a child, I guess it was maybe a year ago, a few months ago. They posted some pictures of this child on Facebook. And it was so just exciting to see those pictures. We don't really, keep in close contact with them like some of our other friends, but we try and keep in, at least kind of aware of what's going on in their lives. And it was just so wonderful to see those pictures and the joy on everyone's face, including the child. That's a wonderful way of being able to share moments in life. I think about another example. As I said, we use different means to try and keep in contact with some of our friends who aren't around here. Something that Connor and I have found is we both enjoy playing video games. A lot of times we end up playing video games as a way of staying in contact. We're talking about all sorts of things, sometimes really deep things, and we're just doing something together in the process. But that's been a wonderful way for us to stay in touch, to strengthen our friendship. But once again, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? I can remember a few instances where either in my own life or in someone else's life, technology, whether it be texting or Facebook or whatever, has been used to figuratively stab someone in the back. Where people have tried to imply or insinuate things and ultimately damaged relationships. There haven't been many, but there's been a few people on things like social media that I've had to block. Simply because there's nothing good being put out there. It's all designed either to just be negative in general or sow misinformation, or it's actually designed to sow discord among brethren. That, I think, is possibly the most tragic of all of these examples we could talk about. How many times even Christians use technology, whether it be video, whether it be social media, just to stir up fights. Just to throw red meat at people who are trying to blame someone, find someone that they can attack, or just to prove how smart they are. I hate to say it, but yes, even Christians fall into that trap sometimes. Media can strengthen friendships and relationships, or it can damage them beyond repair. Notice what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. Something that is so wonderful about the church, and a lot of times I think we take it for granted because we're so used to it, is just how encouraging it is to be with God's people. Just how much you hear people express their care for you. Say, I'm so happy to see you. Say, I'm glad to hear what's going on in your life. I'm encouraged by this thing that's happened to you. Many in the world don't get that. Many in the world don't experience what that's like. They don't have people who are willing to support them in that way. But sometimes, even we can fall short of this goal too. Even we sometimes can, whether in person or in other circumstances, forget that our primary goal in our relationships with one another is to encourage, to help grow. Now, sometimes that can be a difficult process. Sometimes there is such a thing as correcting or rebuking, but it's all with the goal of building up ultimately. Something that I found very interesting, especially in an online context, is how easy it is to feel like there are no consequences to what you say. If I'm typing on a keyboard or texting something or writing something on my phone, there's nobody right there to respond immediately. There's nobody right there to hold me accountable. I can put out hurtful words. I can put out misinformation without any immediate pushback. That anonymity creates monsters at times. People who are sweet and kind in person suddenly turn bitter and spiteful in other contexts. As we have all heard Scripture say, it should not be so. The same mouth should not pour forth blessing and cursing. Back to Solomon, so much wisdom in his words, even for today's day and age. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisper separates close friends. How many times has technology been used to do just this? To spread lies, to draw conclusions and insinuations, or even, going back to our previous point, to avoid dealing with things face to face and keep that mask up, keep that protection up, so you don't actually have to face a situation head on in a responsible way. It's far too easy, but it can cause so much pain. Think about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, the beautiful text that illuminates the idea of love as Christ intended. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. You watch the news for a little bit, scroll through Facebook for a little bit, even sometimes watch TV shows or listen to podcasts. It makes its way there too, and see how often this is the attitude that's presented. It's not very often, is it? Instead, we see complete impatience, rudeness. We see tons of envy and boastfulness. We see arrogance. We see people insisting that only the way they think is the proper way to think. Only the way that they see the world is the proper way to see the world. And I don't mean that they're proposing this in terms of absolute truth, in the sense we understand there is absolute truth. I'm talking about people who won't listen when others try to correct them and help them to see perhaps the truth more plainly, or just the truth in general. Technology can be such a powerful tool to strengthen relationships. It can be such a powerful way for us to help one another. But it also creates so many opportunities for those who would use it wrongfully. And the temptation is there for all of us, whether we realize it or not. But thirdly, media can encourage love or promote lust. This word lust is very interesting. It's not really the same word that we think of in the original language. Lust is a very specific word in our language. We think of lust predominantly in sexual terms, predominantly as it relates to something like adultery or pornography. And we will talk about that in just a moment. But as we move into this third point, I want us to keep in mind that the word lust actually is not as specific in the original language as we have made it in our translations. Lust simply means desire. And the word can be used in a positive or a negative sense. Just like media and technology itself, desire is a tool that can be used for good or evil. We are commanded to desire God, aren't we? We're commanded to desire a relationship with our Father in heaven. It's not a bad form of desire. We're instructed to desire our spouse. That's not a bad form of desire. We're instructed to desire relationships with our fellow man. That's not a bad form of desire. But just like everything else, Satan takes what God has made to be good and twists it into something perverted. Obviously, I would assume that most of us, when we think about lust and media, do go to something like pornography. And it is a very rampant problem, not just in our society, but across the world. It is something that affects far more people than are willing to admit it. I could give you a whole lot of statistics. I don't want to take the time to do all of that tonight. Suffice it to say, one of the most alarming aspects of this is that the statistics between the church and those outside the church are not very different. Statistically, there are several people sitting in this room that have or do currently struggle with such problems, and not just men, That's another common misconception, is that it's confined only to men. It's not. In fact, the number of women as opposed to men percentage-wise that struggle with something like pornography is growing quite quickly. We know from Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5 that such behavior is not right, is not pleasing to him. We should not be looking towards someone else who is not our spouse to try and get some kind of satisfaction physically or mentally, emotionally, whatever we want to go for there. And this is something that I would propose, because it's not a fun topic, we don't talk about. Not much. Every once in a while we'll allude to it. Every once in a while we'll in passing say, and I'm talking about the church now, in passing we'll say this is a bad thing, this is an issue that we need to be aware of, but given how many people struggle with it, we need to address it more. And I don't mean address it more just in saying this is something that needs to be dealt with, this is something that people need to be aware is a sin. Yes, that's a big part of it. But also in saying, just like every other sin, if someone's struggling with it, they need help. And instead of being made to feel ashamed and hopeless without any path forward, just like any other sin, this is an area in which, when people have fallen to the temptations that media can offer in this area, we as the church need to be able to step in and say, let me help you see a way out. I think I've told you all before, I went to I believe the one I went to was Recovery Through Christ. Whenever I was going and preaching school, we were doing a counseling class, and we went and attended one of those meetings just to kind of learn some things in that vein. And what amazed me more than anything in that kind of environment is how encouraging and how loving the people were in trying to help each other. There was no putting someone down for this sin they were struggling with. No one was saying it was okay. No one was excusing that behavior. No one was saying it was acceptable. And there were several different behaviors that were discussed at that meeting, not just things along this line. But the attitude was focused completely on how to move forward and get past those struggles. And all I could think was, man, does the church need more of this attitude? How much good could we do if people could see vividly that that's what we want? We don't just want to tell them they're in sin. We want to help them out of it. We want to offer them whatever we can to show them a way to safety, to peace, a way to let all of that stay behind, a way to escape the cloud of locusts that we talked about this morning, representing the consequences of sin. But even though this is one of the most prevalent forms of lust, if you will, that we can encounter in media, and it's everywhere, I don't want us to end tonight without realizing that that's by no means the only form of lust perpetrated by much of the media today. Back all the way in the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, one of the commandments, God instructed his people, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, goes on and on with this list, or anything that is your neighbor's. Do we realize what the word covet means? It really just means, I want it. It really just means desiring something. In this case, desiring something that someone else has. Now I ask you, how often does media encourage us to desire what others have? How often do the TV shows and the news and the reality TV, how often do they glorify and idolize those who have way more than most of us? How often are they designed to make us envious? How often do advertisements specifically tell us, you deserve this thing that you don't have? How many times do we scroll through Facebook or whatever social media we might be on and subconsciously start comparing ourselves to others and become discouraged, not because we're not doing what God wants us to do, but because we're being trained to compare ourselves to others. And if we measure ourselves by others, we're never going to be good enough. But that's not what God has designed for us. Therefore, Paul would say, put to death what is earthly in you. Fornication, we talked about that already. Impurity, passion, evil desire. This is our word, right? And covetousness, which is idolatry. All of these things, anything that we could let seep into our minds as something that I desire, that I want, it can take hold of us. And oftentimes that's exactly what the world wants us to do. The people who are creating those reality TV shows, they want you to be hooked on your desires to be like the rich and famous. Otherwise, they don't have any viewers. The advertisers want you to covet what they are offering, because then you'll buy their product. Social media loves it when you compare yourselves to others on social media, because then you keep scrolling. Media, it can promote love, as we've already talked about, both through connecting people, through relationships, through stories and powerful messages that can be encouraging and helpful. But it also has great destructive potential in encouraging us to desire what we do not, and often what we should not have. And it's so easy for us not even to realize what's happening in our minds, unless, as we talked about this morning, we look for it. Unless we're aware. Again, I'm not saying if there's advertisements in some form of media, we have to abstain from that form of media. It's not wrong to be exposed to the advertisements. It's wrong to let those advertisements provoke evil desire and covetousness. It's wrong to focus so much on that TV show or that movie and the lifestyle that's presented that we become discontent with what God has given us. And we forget our mission. That's the problem. We said this morning, the media we allow into our lives can have a huge impact on us. But just as powerfully, the media we allow into our lives can have a huge impact on our relationships. Certainly on our relationship with God, but also on our relationship with those in our lives. Both those closest to us, those who are in Christ, brothers and sisters, but also it can have a huge influence on our relationship with those who we're trying to reach. I can't tell you how many times a person has tried to reach someone with the gospel, and that person has seen what kind of an individual the one trying to teach them is online, or what kind of television or movies they take in, and they see hypocrisy, and they don't want to hear anything else. It has a huge influence, and we have a responsibility to use these tools, not for you, but for good, to make sure they're not harming our efforts, but they're helping us to accomplish our goals in the kingdom of Christ. I hope that we keep these things in mind and that we encourage one another in these areas. And if there's anything we can help you with this evening, please let us know as we stand and as we sing.